Okay, I believe we are recording. So let's jump into the lesson. If I'm not recording, someone let me know so that I can stop. All right, great. So before I even continue, are you guys seeing the full screen slide, or are you seeing the slide with all the time and the current slide 1 of 25?
With the time.
Oh, you are? Okay, let me flip it. I don't really like that. There we go. Okay. I feel like that fixed it. Okay, so I did receive a message from uh Mr. Steve Halligan, and this is a homework assignment that you guys want to prepare for your Saturday CMFP workshop day, right? So this is a message from, I believe it's going to be your presenter, Marcus Jones. He says, as we prepare for our final session of intercultural relationships for ministers, I ask each student to identify at least one scenario that illustrates an inappropriate or difficult intercultural interaction or a moment demonstrating insensitivity towards someone from a different culture that they experienced or witnessed. Please send your cultural scenario to me at my diocesan email, m.jones@sbdiocese.org by midnight this Wednesday. All right. So there you have it. Let me, sorry, I gotta move this because it's kind of, there we go. That's better. Okay. Any questions about that? No? All right, let's go. So here we are. Um, the Middle Ages. This is supposed to be a picture of the Palace of Charlemagne, I think it was, or part of it, not the whole thing. But I guess it still stands today, which is interesting because I did not know that. It's pretty fascinating. Um, let's get into the presentation. So, in addition to what I've already kind of talked about by going through the syllabus, I'm going to continue to kind of carve out for us the nature of the Middle Ages, only because it's important that we do not underestimate the events that happened during this time. And we cannot forget the magnitude of the collapse of the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, for example, and the ramifications that had on basically all of civilization outside in even outside of the scope of church history. And I know I mentioned this, but I'm bringing it up again because this is important to the conversation of why the Middle Ages is kind of considered the Middle Age in many ways. So that'll be kind of the first part of our presentation. Then we'll go into the rise of the Franks and the Carolingian Renaissance. Three, we're going to go into the growing split between the East and the West. And then finally, we're going to talk about the rise of Islam. And that is the mosaic of Constantine. I've really come to really like that mosaic. I'm not sure why. It's just a really nice mosaic. Um, okay, great. So let's talk about the nature of the Middle Ages. And honestly, this is something that this should already be familiar to you. Um, you know, hopefully one of the marks of a good teacher is that in many ways, you repeat certain information that's critical to what you're teaching. And at some point, your students should say, yes, 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 we get it. Okay, we get that that's what it was. So hopefully I've created that in regards to this because it's important that we know it. So let's go back to what we learned last week as a kind of refresher. And we left off with the world looking like this, at least the world um, of the ancient world, of the Mediterranean world, Europe, North Africa, Asia, or the Middle East, Asia Minor, Middle East. This is kind of different, right? So again, if we pay attention to this map, if we look at the right side, we have that kind of mustardy brownish color. Um, we have obviously the eastern side of the Roman Empire, which is still surviving, it's still thriving. And on the east, things are looking pretty uniform, all under this one empire. But if you look at the west, clearly things have been divvied up. And we have various barbarian groups that have just completely taken possession of different regions of Italy, Spain, France, Germany. Even if you look at the British Isles, we have Ireland, Scotland, Britain. Then we have Northern Africa. We have the Vandals taking over sort of the ancient city of Carthage. Um, and we also have here Hippo. You guys see where Hippo is? That's where Augustine was, if you guys recall that. So hopefully you're starting to connect the dots if you haven't already. And what this has done to the western side of the Roman Empire is really pretty catastrophic. And when society breaks down like this, it's going to have an effect on the way we present history. So far, if you've noticed in the way we've been presenting history, some of the lessons we've had have been very neat. Okay. And what I mean by that is, let's take, for example, our lessons on the Latin fathers or even the Eastern fathers. We have a very nice chronology of events which give us these really beautiful works of literature, spiritual literature, theological literature. For example, we have the works of Augustine. Um, we have the great works of Saint Athanasius, um, and we have this kind of really nice setting, right, where the emperor is cooperating with the church, helping build the church. We have an emperor that not only makes Christianity legal, but later on we have another emperor who makes Christianity the religion of the empire. When you have a civilization that's thriving like that, it's kind of easier to say tell you to say what history is and to tell history. But when you have your this part of history completely overrun by different groups of barbarians, civilization essentially collapses. So what am I saying with all of this? What I'm saying is when you're studying the Middle Ages, you're not going to find this beautiful, perfect narrative that highlights these great what society would label as these great achievements. Most of the time we're dealing with transitions of power. We're dealing with society just kind of getting back up on its own two legs. Um, we're dealing with slower progress. And most of this progress and a lot of this progress is actually being undertaken, if you guys remember last week, by the Catholic monks. So, that being said, keep in mind that we're moving forward with that mentality. Okay, that's the nature of the Middle Ages. Um, so that's that. So then on the bottom left, that's just the classic barbarian picture that I liked. That's a good one. I found that and I was like, that's really good. I'm gonna have to use that in my presentations. And then on the top right, that's supposed to be not top right, but the middle right, that's supposed to be Saint Augustine of Canterbury. So evangelizing one of the Saxon kings, I think, in England. So all right, let's go. Let's keep going. Let's talk about within this context, the Carolingian world. So, barbarians are overrunning the western side of the Roman Empire, and the church, as we talked about last week, sees an opportunity to evangelize. But there's one particular group that they single out. Those are the Franks. The Franks are um, a Germanic, part of a Germanic tribal group that lived and dwelt in the central eastern region of Europe. Um, and like the other barbarians, they were nomadic, warfaring people. And something interesting about them that caught the church's eye is that they were fresh pagans. Sounds so weird to say it like that, but they actually were. Remember that some of the pagans had already been converted, but they were converted to Arianism. Pretty wild, right? That something like that was going on. But this is shows you how much Arianism had affected Christianity. They had some pagans that were already evangelized by the Arians. But the Frankish king Clovis had not been converted. He was just a fresh pagan. The church said, "Ooh, let's try to get that guy to become a Catholic." So, uh, even though um, his conversion story to Christianity began with him winning a battle on the battlefield, he won a battle much like Constantine, if you guys recall. Um, it is also said that his wife Clotilda, who was Catholic, also had some influence in his conversion. And I guess the bishops kind of did a little bit of a, I'm not going to call it an arranged marriage, but something pretty close to it. Because through Clotilda, Clovis is going to definitely be more influenced to become a Catholic. So this Frankish king becomes Catholic in 486, and he is sort of the first of the Merovingian dynasty or dynasty. The British say dynasty. It's kind of weird, but once you watch The Crown enough, you're like, oh wow, yeah, I kind of get why they say that. And it starts rubbing off on you. It's like, what am I doing? Um, the Merovingian dynasty, they are going to become in many ways allies of the church because as the church tries to kind of bring order and civilization to the West, they're also looking at ways of doing that, right? So once Clovis converts to Christianity, it is almost certain that the rest of his tribe is also going to convert to Christianity. And that's essentially what would happen. And that's why many times the church would go after the chiefs of these barbarian tribes or these kings because they would want to get them, and that meant that everyone else converted. Um, Even though Clovis and the Franks converted to Christianity later on, if you guys remember Saint Columban or Saint Columbanus and his companions, and some missionaries from England and Ireland, and also your guys' favorite Saint Boniface, who was chopping down trees in front of the Germans, Germanic tribes. They're gonna actually have to go back and reinfuse Catholicism into the Franks because they kind of began to lose it a little bit. This is supposed to be an image of Clovis leading a battle. Okay.
Question,
So,
Luis.
yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, can you previous slide? So Clovis converted in Christianity, but he becomes Catholic at 486. At that time, isn't pretty much Christianity and Catholicism synonymous at that point? Or
Okay. So I probably meant, let me go back and look for this, but I probably meant that he got baptized in 486. So it could have been he
um,
accepted the faith in 481 and got baptized in 486, but I gotta go back. That was sloppy on my end. Sorry.
oh,
Um,
no worries, nothing.
no, no, no. But yeah, that's a good question. I'll look it up when we're on small groups.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, good question. Um, but to answer your question, yes. Um, there's really one Christian church up until this point. If you said you were a Christian, you were Catholic. There was no denominations. I think we have 30,000 plus now denominations. Okay, any other questions before we move on? All right. So let's continue. So going back to the Merovingians, by the way, everybody, I'm cutting through a lot of material here because I'm not trying to give you guys a whole lesson on sorry, my arm got a little stiff there. I'm not trying to give you guys an entire lesson on the lineage of the Merovingians and the Carolingians. Um, Feel free to go to Britannica and look that up. But just know for our purposes, what we're looking at here is their relationship to the church, because that's what we're trying to do in this class, right? But if you're into AP European history or European history, definitely go look at them, read more about them. They have a very interesting history. But going back to our lesson, the Merovingians increasingly lost their footholds in the Frankish Empire that they were forming, and that happened gradually, much like the decline of any other um, uh, position like that. It doesn't happen overnight, right? So a lot of what the king was supposed to be doing, a lot of it was kind of being delegated to several people in a similar way that, for example, a king might delegate to his prime minister some of his powers. Well, he started to do that with a particular family, the Carolingian family, and the Carolingian family essentially would replace the Merovingian family with the consent of the Pope, I believe. And that's what happened. Now, there was some really great Carolingians out there. You guys might have heard of Pippin the Short, who's one of them. Charles Martel, who was the one that actually, I'm going to spoiler alert here, but he's the one that defeated the Islamic forces from invading Europe. And then his grandson, Charlemagne. Now, for us, the most important figure here is Charlemagne, because he is going to be the sort of great father of the Carolingian Renaissance. Now, in this sort of period of um, instability and barbarianism, the church trying to bring these tribes to conversion and trying and trying because sometimes they would revert or they would, leave the faith or whatever. We have an example here of a king from the Carolingian line who was a Frank that actually took a great interest in propagating the arts. That includes literature, music, geometry, um, very much something, it's almost like he was a Roman or a Greek himself, right? So now we have a former, or at least his ancestors, right? His ancestors who were former barbarians, now he's king, accepted the faith, is now a Catholic, and we see him not only propagating this, but encouraging bishops to build schools around the cathedrals. That's an interesting piece of history. Originally, the cathedrals, not only were they the seats of the bishops, but the cathedrals were also basically schools where you went to learn stuff. I mean, now we have, I know that Holy Rosary, our cathedral, has a school, but even greater than just like an elementary school, they were like centers of learning. So Charlemagne is remembered for that. And because he was from the Carolingian family and he was a Frankish king from that family, we call it the Carolingian Renaissance. It's a rebirth in trying to go back and recover what had been the best of the Roman and the Greek culture. Keep in mind, however, the Carolingian Renaissance does come to an end. Um, and really, depending on who you read, they say that it died with Charlemagne, the Renaissance, but some some writers will extend it to Louis the Pious. So honestly, it doesn't matter which one you pick. because what's the point here? The point is here in this time that is supposedly filled with darkness and chaos, and this is usually how this is presented in your secular universities. We actually have a beautiful example of how the church is moving forward with actually presenting a worldview that is faith plus the arts. And remember what we learned from St. Augustine. For St. Augustine, it was everything serves faith. So we must learn the arts. All the arts are in service of faith. Well, there's also another little note here for us. The Pope's going to crown Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor. And we'll talk about what that means um, later. Probably, I'm not even sure I'm going to talk about it too much in this class. But what is happening here as well is the Pope is starting to distance himself more and more from his dependence on Constantinople. Okay, so keep that in mind because we're getting somewhere with that. Here's a really cool picture. That's Charlemagne. That's the Pope. Okay. Um, I guess those are some altar boys. Um, so that is the Carolingian Renaissance. Here's if you're kind of more interested in I again this is kind of really distilling here some of the stuff you guys read. Feel free to look up more of this material. Um Charlemagne had a thing for the Latin language, apparently. So he tried as much as possible to transcribe Latin manuscripts and to preserve Latin itself, the language. So Latin was a big thing for this guy. And um, the liberal arts, which were propagated during the Carolingian Renaissance, were actually divided into seven: the quadrivium and the trivium. So if you add 4 plus 7, 4 plus 3, it's seven, right? You have astronomy, music, that's just say arithmetic, and geometry. The trivium consists of logic, grammar, and rhetoric. Then we have the Carolingian minuscule, um, which you can have fun also researching, but um, the minuscule is an important tool which helped sort of basically organize writing, for lack of better words. You can get into all the intricacies of what all that means. But for us, for this class, the purpose is these are the achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance. And we definitely see here an amicable position between the church and really the new state of Charlemagne. What happens when the Carolingian Renaissance sort of fades back away? Well, again, we start to see that the church starts to step in. This is a trend, by the way, you'll start to see in history is anytime secular government is failing, the church kind of steps in to try to help. And that's what also happens during this time. Alcuin, who was a pupil of or student of Bede the Venerable, was one of the strongest catalysts for the propagation of the Carolingian Renaissance. I mean, that guy was a complete scholar. I think he came up a few times in our readings, and I wish Benedict had written something about him, but he didn't. But Alcuin of York is just renowned for, you know, it, almost being one of the spearheaders of the Carolingian Renaissance. So you could look at him. That is supposed to be a statue of Charlemagne. Let's talk for a moment here about Bede the Venerable. We talked quite a bit about last class about the monks and how most of them had just really this incredible thirst and love for Christ, and how their time in monastery led them to go and evangelize. I want to talk this in this case about a figure who I personally think really captures as well the spirit of the Carolingian Renaissance, and that's Bede the Venerable, which is why you guys had to read him. Hopefully, when you read him in um your readings for this week with Benedict the 16th, there we go. Um, you picked up a sense of who this man was. And for me, when I was reading about him, especially in the context of the Middle Ages, I was like, yeah, this kind of feels to me what the Carolingian Renaissance was kind of partly about, not the whole thing, but it's a good sort of example. I try to pull an example. He's mostly remembered for writing the ecclesiastical history of the English people. That's something you guys read about. But his ability to incorporate scripture, history of the church fathers, the council, he was definitely a student of history. And for us, that's important because we're historians, right? We're trying to do history here. Um, just models perfectly, uh, really the efforts the church is making to not only Christianize, but also preserve history. Um, I mean, to write a history of the ecclesiastical history of the English people, that's no small feat, right? And he saw his vision in particular, and this is one of the quiz questions that you guys had, is his vision for the Catholicity of the church was to bring the faith to all peoples in the way that best is that it's best incorporated into their own reality, so to speak, while maintaining, of course, the Catholicity, the actual faith, right? So he's a really good example. One of the things that stood out to me about him is that I mean, at the age of 7, basically became a monk, which is nuts, but he did it. Um, Great guy, good example of I think a shining light amidst this period of instability, right? So that's why you read him. Here's one of the lines that we Benedict the 16th shares with us in his audience. That Bede wrote in his ecclesiastical history. He says, "I beseech you, O good Jesus, that to the one to whom you have graciously granted sweetly to drink in the words of your knowledge, you will also vouchsafe in your loving kindness that he may one day come to you, the fountain of all wisdom, and appear forever before your face." I mean, he just wrote that, right? That's beautiful. It's a reflection of his deep spirituality. Um, Another reason I'm really emphasizing everybody some of these figures that we're reading in Benedict is because that gives you very particular people and examples to point to when you're talking about this. You say, well, how did the monks save Western civilization? What are you talking about when you say, well, have you heard of St. Boniface? Have you heard of St. Columban? Have you heard of Bede the Venerable? Have you heard of St. Benedict? I mean, these are real historical figures that have made contributions to the history of the church, right? And this is why um, this era is it is certainly a period where darkness is happening in the world, but for the church is preserving so much of the beauty that existed in ancient times, right? As well as bringing faith into it. So it's important for me that you guys understand that, um, because we don't want to dismiss the Middle Ages as just a period where all monks did was pray, and they didn't have anything to do with they didn't have any interest or had anything to do with preserving any type of um, any important part of the classical world, any part of antiquity, that they were just concerned with prayer. No, this is a reality that we see here. And you look at someone like Charlemagne who worked together with the Holy Father. I mean, this is again, it's these are good examples. And of course, let's not forget about the monks. So, um, the Carolingian Renaissance, we have the monks, um, and yeah, we're charging forward. And these are the monks we learned about last week, or some of them. I'm not sure if I got all of them in here, but all right, let's continue. I'm gonna try to get through this next section fairly quick because I don't want to waste too much time here. Tensions brewing. So all of this is happening in the West, right? You have the Pope working and collaborating with monks like Saint Augustine to try and go convert the Angles and the Saxons in Britain, and then you have um, Saint Colum Saint Columba converting the Scots, the Picts who were really the Scotsmen. Then you have Saint Columban going back to mainland France um, to do all. So the West is full missionary mode, right? And there's a lot going on though in the background with the East. So let's just recall for one moment. Okay. Again, this is one of those moments where I'm going to take us back to something that I've talked about probably ad infinitum, but it's important for us. Remember that this big conflict, this sort of tension that kind of was in the background between the East and the West in the sense of Christianity, but even outside of that, is when Constantine moves the capital to the East. Remember he moves the capital from Rome to Constantinople. Now, yes, I know I've talked about the spread of Christianity being primarily in the East and how they technically have more years in it, and therefore they're more developed in it. But this particular move here is important, and we're going to see why. Again, there's that picture we love of Constantine. We are going into shortly here see the Great Schism in 1054. Some of you friends are completely familiar with the Great Schism. You know probably a lot more about it than I do. But I'm going to give you the sort of cliff notes on it that will help you understand what happened. How did we get here? But for those of us who might not know, the Great Schism that we talk about in the Catholic Church in history of 1054 is when the Eastern and Western churches excommunicated each other and have been operating independently from one another since then. That image is supposed to be an image of a papal uh, delegate and the patriarch um, excommunicating each other. It's pretty brilliant. Um, but how did we get to that? How did we get to the point where the church in the West, whom we've been talking about quite extensively in this class, and the church of the East are literally excommunicating each other? What happened there? How did we get here? So it's my job to help us understand that at least a little bit. Excuse me. So, I'm going to touch on that first point more later, but just know one thing at this time, roughly 7th, 8th centuries, we are starting to see a spirit of isolation happening in the East, partly due because of the growing presence of Islam and the Arabs in the Middle East. And I'll talk about why we're using those terms interchangeably because I know that Vidmar brings that up in his text. Um, but just know that there's some stuff going on in the East that's causing some other issues that we have not talked about. And of course, the cultural differences. Cultural differences. You guys should know this already. Hopefully, this sounds super familiar to you. Okay, this should not be new. The East, in general. Okay, we're generalizing here. Not that we can't find exceptions. More philosophical, more theoretical, more theological. In the West, we're talking more practical, more technological, and more concerned with law. Just a cultural difference, right? And that already kind of sets things not opposed to each other, but different from each other. There's also some religious differences happening between the East and the West. For the East, the Pope was not the supreme authority. Okay. The Pope had kind of lost that when Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople. When the emperor decided to do that, That pretty much moved things around a little bit. Okay. And it didn't necessarily mean that this whole time that the Pope was the supreme authority. Um, if you were to ask someone in the East, they'd probably say to you, you know, Peter dying and Paul dying in Rome, that was, yeah, they were apostles, but they also founded churches in the East. And technically, it's more symbolic, right? It's the apostolic see in Rome is more symbolic. It's not does not necessarily denote administrative headquarters. For the East, the idea that the Pope would have supreme authority is not something they agree with. And this issue um, is the issue that we have today, assuming that everyone here is Roman Catholic, with the Eastern Church. Okay. The filioque. The filioque, for those of you who might not be familiar with that term, is and the Son. That means filio, son, que is and the Son. I should have italicized that. Actually, I did italicize. I'm not sure why it's not italicized. And the Son. It was a council that was held where and the Son was added to the creed. And if you remember, the Nicene Creed does not originally have that attached. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit. Let me, you know what? Hang on. I actually gotta read this to you guys just because I always get and this is a classic, right? Catholic problems. You confuse your Nicene Creed with your Apostles' Creed. I just do like a blend of both, I think, which is which is not ideal. Don't do that. That's not a good. I'm not being a good role model for you guys to blend both of the creeds. I should just do the Saint Athanasius Creed. Okay, so if you guys look at the Nicene Creed on the USCCB, on the part on the second part, third part, sorry, it says, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father. See, for the Eastern Church, that's it. Proceeds from the Father. But if you're in the Western Church, we say and the Son. Okay. So they say who proceeds from the Father, who with the Father and Son is adored and glorified. So in the Latin Church, we say who proceeds from the Father and the Son. So when this change happened, the Eastern Church was like, "How could you do that? You just changed the Nicene Creed. That's completely wrong. How could you? How I mean, that creed was put together by the Nicene Fathers. They were pretty outraged by it. Then we have icons. You guys read about iconoclasm, and honestly, it's as bad as it sounds. In the East, there was a period where religious images were just, completely seen as idolatrous almost and bad, right? And there was sort of the destruction of a lot of images during that time. And so Constantinople had become suspicious of it. By the way, St. John Damascene is going to become a doctor of the church later on for defending the use of images in the church. I mean, what would we do without our images? I have a crucifix. I have Lady Guadalupe. I mean, if there if there was ever a case against iconoclasm, it would be the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. I mean, if God really did not want images from heaven above, he would definitely the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe and the tilma would definitely have not been there, right? Okay. And they kind of didn't like that their Catholic Church was using kind of another emperor to back itself up, Charlemagne. So see, Charlemagne and the church were best buddies. So just note that for Roman Catholics, the Pope is certainly a legitimate figure. And there's certain passages in scripture where Saint Peter is given leadership in in the role of the 12 apostles. And here we have the famous Matthew 16:18, I think, is I'll give you the keys, Peter, whatever you bind, whatever you loose, right? So the successor of Peter would have been the one that assumed the episcopacy in Rome, because that's where Peter died. And that would have been Clement the First, I believe. So technically, Peter's successor would have been the Roman successor. But again, if you ask an Easterner to say, well, it's symbolic. It's not, yeah, it's the apostolic see, but it's not exactly that, right? I'm sure if I had someone that was Eastern here, they'd start debating me like crazy about it. And I would probably just, I don't know, take a sip of water because I'm thirsty.
Louis, can I ask another question right now?
Please, no, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So, is it fair to say or unfair to say that since, the Eastern Church, they were still Christian nonetheless, even though they were different than the Western side of the church,
Oh,
which
no,
means that
absolutely.
which means that they thought well, they knew that Jesus was divine. So in terms of the Philocate question, it wasn't so much, is it fair to say that it wasn't so much that they were theologically opposed to it because they know Jesus is divine and therefore the Holy Spirit comes from the Father and the Son? Was it more that they were just upset that they were not included in the decision-making process? Or were they also theologically against the concept?
I would say all the above. Remember that Arianism was strongest in the East. It was strongest in the East. Yeah, all the above, I would say, is my response to that. Yep. In fact, if I had a quiz question, I would put all the above and mention everything you just said. Um, Also, for the Easterners, they thought, how could you guys do that? Like the Nicene Fathers, they closed that council with that creed. Like don't touch it anymore, kind of a thing. Adding and the Son is like, whoa, that's where did you get that? Like, do you even understand the subtleties theologically of what that implies? And so yeah, that's a good way of wrapping that up, Jerry. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Luis. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I like that. That was perfect actually. Any other questions before we continue? All right, let's continue so we can take a break after this. Um, Political differences. I already mentioned Charlemagne's Pope, Holy Roman Emperor. He's sorry, crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in the year 800. Um, More than anything, this was a symbol that the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire no longer had jurisdiction in the West. Okay. So the West was definitely, they were they were just sending innocently, they were doing some stuff that I'm sure was like, wait, what's going on, right? But it's what happened. Um, we did we cover Caesar papism? I think we might have, but just in case we didn't, in the East, it was. So if you guys remember, Council of Nicaea was called by an emperor, and so all of basically the councils and the appointment of bishops and a lot of stuff that basically the Pope would do today was done by the emperor early on when the empire was still both East and West. So the East, when the emperor moved to the East, he started doing that in the East quite a bit. So that when the emperor controls a lot of church decisions and controls a lot of the church's administrative operations like that. That's called Caesar papism. Another interesting note that I was surprised that Vidmar included this, but the donation of Constantine is a document that sort of outlines supposedly how all the temporal and religious powers Constantine had granted to the Pope. Apparently, it was a document that was actually kind of I guess you call it a forgery, but apparently people believed it. And it's in there. Kind of just gives you a sense of how things kind of rolled in the Middle Ages. So there's that in the mix. And then finally, just a quick note, spoiler alert, is the Byzantine Empire, or what is now the Eastern Roman Empire, will last for another 800 years or so, and will finally be completely um, uh, gone, vanished from history by the 15th century when it falls under attack by the Turks or the Ottomans. So, there there you have it, everybody. That is the political differences of the understanding the Great Schism. So we've talked about the religious differences. We've talked about some of the political differences, and all of this is starting to amount to the Great Schism. So, just this is kind of a quick offshoot note that I'm going to include just about Roman history for those of you who are interested. Um, the East after this part, so the East definitely associated more with relying on the emperor um, than the West. And remember Saint Ambrose when he made the Emperor Theodosius, I think pronounced his name right. When he made him do penance, that's kind of one of when he made him do penance for the massacre that happened in Thessalonica. That him making the emperor do penance to come back into the church, that's one of the reasons that Saint Ambrose is a doctor of the church. That's called um, that's called setting an example. That's a pretty intense example too, but that's essentially what we have here. So the West didn't really allow the emperor to get away with stuff like that. But we'll see how things pan out. Quick side note, Emperor Justinian is considered the last great Roman emperor. Um, he is the last Roman emperor that actually tried to reconquer some of the western part of the Roman Empire. So just in case you were interested in that, throw that in for you. He also developed a sophisticated legal system that the church and European countries use. So the basis for canon law, um, and it's called the Codex Justinianus. So uh, look into some of his stuff. Anytime you're studying the Middle Ages, he'll come up. It's kind of like a section. Okay, so you do want to know about him a little bit, but he managed to conquer parts of Spain, almost all of Spain, and Northern Africa. So he could have potentially restored the Roman Empire, but he didn't. So too bad. And that's supposed to be a mosaic, if I might believe. Okay, let's take a break, everybody. Oh, wait, no. This is the final showdown. How can I take a break now? Let's get into the moment it actually happened. Behold, the great schism, friends. So there's first the Phocian. I hope I spelled that right. Schism. The Phocian schism is not the Great Schism, but you'll read this and then you'll be like, "Wait, I'm confused. What the heck's going on here?" But do not fret. The Phocian schism happened 200 years before the Great Schism, and it's kind of like a precursor to what's going to happen. But Patriarch Photius is elected patriarch, but he's an iconoclast sympathizer. Rome doesn't like that. So what does Rome do? Rome excommunicates him. So they elect this patriarch. This guy seems to agree that images are not a good idea. Let's excommunicate that. All right, Rome. Let's good job there. Um, well, that was not good. Because essentially that's essentially a schism. I mean, he excommunicated him. Um, he, however, is going to be deposed because his primary backer, the Emperor Michael III, um, is going to die. So his predecessor is going to take the wheel again, and His predecessor is going to take the wheel again, and sorry, I'm blanking out here. And things will go back to normal. Later on, however, Photius is going to then take the patriarch, take on the patriarch and patriarchy. It's funny that word. And Rome will acknowledge his election. Okay, sorry about that. I didn't mean to confuse you. So first, this guy gets elected. Rome doesn't like him. He gets excommunicated. He gets deposed because he no longer has the proper backing from the emperor because he's dead, and his predecessor takes his place. Later on, this guy gets elected again, and Rome says, "Fine, we're cool with it." What this did, however, is when you excommunicate someone like that, that's not a good precedent. Okay, so that's bad. You don't want to just excommunicate a patriarch like that. Later, 200 years later, in 1054, an excommunication will actually happen over the question of liturgy. Southern Italy, their people are wanting the mass in Greek or the liturgy in Greek. The Pope says no. No way, right? Everyone does the mass in Latin. You're in Italy, you're in the West. Mass is in Latin. Well, the Patriarch of Constantinople hears that the Pope is imposing the Latin Mass on everybody in southern Italy and says, "Fine, I'm going to do the same exact thing, except I will not allow Latin Masses said in Constantinople or over here in general. So I'm going to close down all of those masses as well." Liturgy wars, huh? Talk about a liturgy war. And all masses will be said in Greek. So Rome says no to Greek. Now Constantinople says no to Latin. Of course, Pope's enraged, and they decide to send a papal delegate to Constantinople. As soon as the papal delegate gets there, he's kind of treated poorly, and he gets mad. He excommunicates the patriarch, and the patriarch excommunicates the pope. And sadly, folks, that is the story of the Great Schism. Because of that moment in history, the Catholic Western Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church have not seen eye to eye since 1054. All of what we've been learning about the differences between the East and the West, and is the Pope, and is he have supreme authority, and all this other stuff. Um, and the West having their own emperor, but we have one emperor over here. How could you crown another emperor? We're all confused about that. All of this crescendos into this moment where there's a liturgy war going on, and they excommunicate each other simply because they think one is more powerful than the other.
Hi,
And
Luis. I have a
yes,
question. Do we know who the delegate was? Because the delegate
yeah,
was sent over. Yeah,
yeah, we do know the name of the guy. Let me look it up for you. Do apologize for not having that. Who excommunicates? Think it was no, wait. Do we have Cardinals yet?
that's what I was going to ask. Like, what was his
Oh,
authority? It was a
uh,
cardinal. It
Cardinal
was.
Humbert of Silva Candida.
Oh,
Yep.
he's a cardinal.
It was actually on, to be exact, July 16th. Now, here's the part where I'm confused about. Maybe you guys know more about this than me. Is the question of, because my understanding is that Pope Benedict lifted that excommunication, and then also the patriarch. Forget, I don't know who the patriarch is, but he lifted the excommunication on the Pope. So they both lifted up the excommunication, but what does that even mean? I don't know. Lack of clarity. Okay. Any questions about the Great Schism? Okay, everybody. Again, this is we're really simplifying history here quite a bit. So hopefully you stuck around for that first segment. My goal was to make it simple and not get too caught up in too many details. But hopefully you understood so far the role of obviously the monks. You guys got that part down. But the Carolingian Renaissance, Charlemagne's backing of the Pope, how that kind of increased tensions in between the church in the West and the East. And then finally, all the cultural, religious, and political um, factors that probably contributed to this attitude that both the East and the West had when they excommunicated each other. If you got that down, we're good. You can always go back and brush up on details. But for now, that's good. Any questions, comments, or concerns? All right, everybody, let's do a quick break. Let's do 10 minutes so we can have time to discuss. Maybe need more time, 10 minutes. So let's do you know what? We'll make it fine. We'll make it 13 minutes, right? Yeah, 13 minutes. We'll do 8:25. 8:25, everybody. We'll come back at 8:25. Thank you. Let me, how do I, gotta pause recording. See here. A recording. So we'll just get through this next part, and then we will start our discussions. So here we have the Great Schism, and now let's move on to our next uh, really big event here, the rise of Islam. And this event in world history is perhaps one of the greatest events in terms of impact for Christianity in the history of Christianity. Um, Islam is going to completely change the world, and we'll see why. But we were talking here about the Middle Ages. This event changes the nature of the Middle Ages as well, especially in the East. And we're going to see why that's the case. So Islam means surrender from Aslama. And this is going to be a religion founded by Muhammad, who at the age of 25, after getting married, began to frequent a cave where he's said to have received visions, particularly from the angel Gabriel. These visions, by the way, eventually he would these visions would are going to evolve into him receiving the Quran. And so that is essentially what how their holy book is formed. But after the foundation of his religion, Islam's going to grow tremendously. Um, we're not going to go into all the beliefs of Islam, but one of the things that we'll talk about is some of their basic beliefs. So they're monotheistic. There's only one God. Jesus was not him. And for Catholics, um, Islam is just another form of Arianism, really, because it's a denial of the divinity of Jesus. Islam also adheres to a strict morality, and they have a belief in a radical equality before God. According to Vidmar, right? This is all Vidmar. By 717, Islam had conquered all of Northern Africa, Arabia, and Spain. So we'll kind of show you guys a map of that in a second. Some achievements Islam has um, had in history, just to kind of as a side note, they're the great inheritors of Greek philosophy. So they achieved a lot in philosophy, mathematics, and art, particular geometric art. In Islam, you are forbidden from painting um, sacred images. Um, and so you can't even paint an image of Muhammad. So the way they express their art is through geometric patterns or through calligraphy. So you see that picture, that is an image of a calligraphy of Allah, which is Allah is God. And so, just to kind of give you an example, a little bit of the Islamic culture. So, if you go to the Middle East today, you're not going to really find a whole lot of traditional Western art. Um, Greek thought had been handed on to the Arabs by the Christians, and the Christians will now be handed Greek philosophy by the Arabs. And that's going to be a topic for our next class. We're going to hang on tight to this. By the way, you'll notice that there's already overlap in a lot of our classes because we're kind of building slowly. Um, if our last class was showing the lay of the land of the church and monasticism missionary, this one's kind of giving you the lay of the land for what's going on in the secular world. Um, so there you go. Um, Fun fact is, for example, algebra was developed by the Arabs, by Islam, I believe, is in particular the ones that anything. My understanding is anything with AL has some type of Islamic influence behind it, right? So if you go to any of the cities in Spain, and they have AL in their name or certain spellings, it's going to denote some type of Arab um, influence there. Do have some common ground with Christians, by the way. They were really blessed mother. They possesses similar Jewish roots in the sense of morality. They believe that praying and fasting are ways of getting closer to God. They rely on a holy book or a sacred text. Um, we along with the Jews consider Abraham the great father of our religion, even in Christianity, right? He's the father of the chosen people. And Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are the great monotheistic religions of the world. There's again the Allah calligraphy written, and then of course the crucifix. Okay, here we go. So let's talk about this map for a minute. This map, which is you can find this on Wikipedia, shows the expansion of Islam um, a little over 100 years after Muhammad. So by the time you reach 750, you have Islam completely expanded all over the Middle East, all over Arabia, all over Northern Africa. You look at Spain, pretty much all of Spain, and then even going into Asia, Iran, um, modern day Afghanistan, all those areas, Pakistan, um, all that whole region, it gets conquered by Islam. So think about that map for 1 second. All of those lands that you see there were once upon a time Christian lands. Actually, not all of them. That's wrong. The ones that you see, Northern Africa, Spain, and the Middle East, those are formerly Christian lands, not Iran and some of the other ones. There were some Christians there, I'm sure, but to say that they're Christian lands completely, I don't know if I could say that. But um, all those areas with the patriarchs of Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in modern day Syria, Turkey ish area, and Jerusalem, those patriarchies are going to dissolve into history. They don't exist. They're gone. And then this is the world after 750. So Christianity is left in that little small pocket, that little small part of Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. In the east, that's where it is. And then you have it obviously existing in the Balkan territory, which is that area right next to Italy, sandwiched in between Italy and the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea. So Christianity becomes something that gets sort of pushed into Europe. If you guys remember Charlemagne, his great grandfather, Charles Martel, when the Muslims were trying to get into Europe via Spain, I believe, Spain, they actually fought. And if it wasn't for Charles Martel, who was a Carolingian king, um, we would all probably be seeing a different Europe. Chances are maybe some of us will be Islamic here. If you have some type of European ancestry, I imagine that that whole region would have become Islamic, and who knows what else would have happened. But just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this event, not only in the church, but even in history, just in general history, we have now a force to be reckoned with in the East. Now, if you guys remember what I said about Christianity, especially in the West with the Pope, they were trying to civilize and convert the barbarians. Why was Islam so attractive? Well, for one, Islam was a monotheistic religion. Islam originated in Saudi Arabia, and all of that whole area was there were tribal and nomadic, all of those areas, and they were polytheistic. So they had different gods, and you know, they were introduced to monotheism, and they were probably attracted to the uniformity that monotheism offered, especially the monotheism of Muhammad, because it was pretty clear. There's one God, we submit to God, and we live by his law. And there's no one greater than him, and no one's greater than the law. And we are all the same because we're created by him. So it's done, right? And of course, they have their religious practices very much like Catholics do. But in terms of Christianity, now Christianity is having to deal with this in the East. So remember, we talked about iconoclasm. Part of the reason that they wanted to tone down iconoclasm, trying to tone down the use of images, was because in Islam that was not okay. You can't have images of people. You can't do that. You can't venerate images. There's only one God. It's Allah, right? And Allah is you can't even represent an image. It's insulting to think about even trying to do something like that. So in the East, this silly back and forth between the East and the West after 750 it definitely seems even more silly, right? When you have a situation like this, an entire region of the world that is now under the influence of a new religion. So another thing that Muhammad and his religion brought were not only uniformity of religion, but in many ways it brought a higher form of civilization to the people of Saudi Arabia. As I said, some of them were very tribal, nomadic people. Oh geez, what are they called? Didn't they come out in Lawrence of Arabia? Who am I thinking of, people? The original tribal Arab people of Saudi Arabia. I can't think of their name at the moment. Um, but they existed. And of course they all came under Islam. And for us, you know, w- we have to be aware of this, that this is going to change everything in the East. Um, and even not only iconoclasm, but just the East is now dealing with a different reality. Now they have to reckon with Islam. They have to reckon with that, and eventually, now they're gonna get now. Not only do they have to reckon with it, but they are going to essentially get conquered by the Ottomans. Um, so again, if anyone makes a point that when you say Arab and Muslim, they're used interchangeably because for the longest time they were the same. It was given that, you know, if you were Arab during this time period or a Saracen, that, you know, they were used interchangeably. So that's the only reason we're using those terms interchangeably now is because of that. All right. So any questions about Islam?
Yes, Luis. So as Christians or non Muslims, what is those visions that Muhammad had? Do we believe like he was like do we believe that he was using drugs, that he was like, getting high? What is our thought regarding those visions from? I don't know if you
That's a
could.
great question. That's a great question. Yeah. So, in Christianity, we believe the final revelation was with Jesus Christ. And there was no revelation after him. And I'm speaking here, of course, of divine revelation. So he is the final revelation. So in Christianity, we would consider um this just another form of Arianism. Um, you know, Islam and Catholicism have an interesting relationship with each other. Who was it? Saint Francis of Assisi. He went down to go see. I think it was the Caliphate or the Sultan. The Caliphate, for those of you who might not be familiar with Islam, is so in Islam there is no pope. There is no one religious leader, which is also part of the reason that everyone interprets the Quran differently. So in Islam, you can have someone reading the Quran and saying one thing and someone else saying another thing, which is why in Islam, Muslims don't condemn each other for interpreting the Quran a certain way because it's the Quran, it's the holy book. Um, but in their history, there have been leaders that they call caliphates. These are religious political leaders whose job it is to bring sort of the Islamic order to their to their to their people, as well as even war. Um, oh yeah, right there. It says the caliphates, right? They were all listed on the thing. So caliphate is kind of like it's kind of they're I'm not going to call them successors to Muhammad because they would disagree with me on that. And I agree with them that I won't call them successors to Muhammad, but they're very close to like a leader. They would follow a caliphate. Um, but they organize themselves differently. Um, most so once you start getting into Catholic scholars and what everyone says about Islam is that Islam is a blend of Judaism, Christianity, and of course Islam. So, for example, you'll find in Islam a lot of rules against eating pig, right? Like certain dietary restrictions that are very aligned with Judaism. But then you'll find some really Catholic stuff in there, like veneration to Mary. They don't venerate Mary, but I've talked to Muslims and they love Mary. They love her. They think she's great. They actually really revere her. They respect her. They have a great respect for Mary. Um, they, um, I mean, they have certain characters, you know, that we believe in as well, like Saint Gabriel, right? They believe Jesus was a prophet. A lot of people will say that Muhammad was just a very wealthy businessman as well, which he was. And maybe he used religion as a way of increasing his followers. You read some of that too. I mean, there's a lot of stuff you could read, but my personal view, and I think the view of most Catholic scholars, is that Muhammad was blending multiple religions that he had come across because he was a traveler. So he was a merchant and he was able to see everything that was going on with the Christians and everything's going on with the Jews. And who knows, he might have, I don't know if he was on drugs, right? But um mm, yeah, yeah. So that's his his style of, not his style, but that's the foundation of his religion. So yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. Um, Feel free to look more into it. In terms of church history, dramatic, very dramatic. Everybody, you guys see the Spain, the Iberian Peninsula there? That's in yellow. Well, that's going to be in about 1,000 years, a little less than that. That's going to be reconquered by Ferdinand and Isabella when they unite the kingdoms of Spain in the north, and they reconquer Spain in the Reconquista. So a lot of people think the Reconquista was like this violent Catholic reaction, but actually it was the Spanish Catholics trying to get back the land that they had lost centuries before to Muslim invasion. So um, that being said, I know Muslims, and they are the Muslims I know very, very generous people, very kind people. In fact, my best friend growing up was a Muslim, and they treated me like a brother. That being said, a lot of them, I think their family at one point thought I was Muslim or Arab, and I was like, not quite. So I'm I'm just like a normal Mexican dude. So I'm not Arab at all. So I I know I'm very familiar with their culture. And you'll meet all kinds of different Muslims, but the Muslims I've known, we've had great respect for each other, and I think we have a lot in common. Um, that really does bring us together. That being said, I can't ignore the fact that, you know, there's some stuff that, you know, I read in their Quran that I just simply look at and say, I don't think I agree with that. That seems a little bit wild to me. I also don't, I'm not really sure if I completely on the same level with them on their views of their morality that they impose on women. I think is sometimes given my Catholic background, I don't think it's the most Christian. Okay, so so there's things like that. But again, more than anything, I think there's a lot of questions we can get into about what they believe and what they do. But for the most part, I think for us in church history right now, um, be familiar with this map. It's very telling. It's very telling, and I knew we would spend a couple minutes on it because it's impressive what happened here. Um, when yeah. So, any questions, comments, or concerns about this?
Luis, this is Saul. I had a question. Is there any truth to the lineage of Abraham to the Arabs? I mean, it's not Abraham, but his son Ishmael.
Yeah, you're right on that. That's right. So, biblical roots. For those of you who are familiar, and for those of you who are interested, uh, Islam claims that their actual founder was Abraham, but through the firstborn Ishmael. Now, for Muslims, if you ask them who was Abraham's firstborn, they'll say Ishmael. Therefore, the one that carried the promises was Ishmael. Okay. So they are descendants, or they'll claim to be descendants of Ishmael. Um, Much like Christians will claim to be descendants of Isaac. Now, this is where knowing your scripture, everybody, is really important. This is why in the Old Testament, this I try to teach this to my students when I used to teach scripture. I said, okay, guys, why is it important that God says, I am your God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Okay, because God when he says that, he's reaffirming what? He's reaffirming that the promises came through Isaac because it was the firstborn of Sarah, not Agar. That's right. So they're right that Abraham had a firstborn son. Yeah, no doubt. Firstborn with Hagar was Ishmael, but the firstborn whom the promises were made, when the promises were made, was with Sarah. Okay, so that one's pretty interesting. So yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Yep, 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 yep. Um, by the way, Catholics and Muslims in history, they've had actually pretty good mutual respect for each other. I know, like once we get into the Crusades, we'll learn about the mutual respect that was it Baldwin the Fourth and Saladin had for each other. Hopefully, I'm saying that right, and I'm not just grabbing that from the Kingdom of God, which is a movie that kind of goes to the history of the Crusades a little bit. The Leper King. I'm not sure if you guys have read that, but don't worry, we're gonna touch the Crusades. I'm not gonna leave you guys hanging. We have to cover them. It's part of the time period. But oh, actually, this is good. So remember this because this is going to explain the Crusades to you. Okay. Remember this lesson because later on the Christians are going to say, wait a second, we lost all our land. We should get it back. But then it gets real political and it gets really crazy and stuff like that. So we'll talk about that, of course. But any other questions, comments, or concerns? Alrighty, everybody, great. We're gonna have a solid 30 minutes of discussion, or 40 minutes of discussion in our small groups, and maybe even large groups. So this makes me very happy. Um, I really wanted to have time for that today. So let me go ahead and stop the recording for now. Let me find the recording. All right, some more. Wait, is there any more slides? Is that the last one? Let me make sure that's the last slide. Okay, that is the last slide. Okay, great. Pause. All right, your screen sharing is paused. Wait, that's my screen sharing. Okay, hold up. I want to stop the recording. Stop recording. Well, that